Good morning. Business idea. Okay, so we're in the age now where we're documenting ourselves, our lives, so much so that, say, afterlife, your friends and families now have an opportunity to go back through and watch videos, read things, re-experience content in which you've created. Kind of thinking along the lines of, we just lost Ken Block, but it's interesting because it's a tragedy, right? But there's so much footage of things that he's done, right? Gymkhana and all the rally racing, the DC shoes thing. Like there's a lot of different things. So there's a ton of content, video, information out there, so that you can now look back and you can experience for the first time or re-experience the life of Ken Block. That's really, and he was kind of a prolific person. I said what he's done for rally racing is next level. You're talking celebrity, famous people who are creating a lot of this content. Okay, apply that to your everyday average person. How much content are you creating? Say if you're prolific on social media, you're putting out some videos. Still probably not that much on average. Some people probably more than others, but then on the spectrum, some people are probably not recording themselves at all, not taking photos. Like in my family, we typically don't take a lot of photos of ourselves. It just wasn't that big of a thing. And then you can even go even further. Culturally, there are some cultures that believe photos take part of your soul away, so they really don't take any photos. So there's really no record of this person ever existing, right, after the fact. So it's hard, right? During the moment, everything's real, everything's alive, we're all here, we're experiencing things. But then after the fact, if there's no photos, it never happened. If there's no concrete evidence, that memory kind of fades away a little bit. So the idea here, and thinking, like something afterlife, right? You can aggregate all of this data and content and kind of put it together and create, let's take a person, let's take participant, Bob Smith. Okay, he's living his life. He's got some sports videos from when he was a kid. Here's some content that he put on social media for work. Here's some videos that he was doing because he was, training. So he made some training videos. At a bare minimum, you've got, a few hours worth of things that you could look at to kind of understand who Bob Smith is. What about his message? What about information that he wants to share with the world? Maybe he had some really profound thoughts that he wanted to share with everybody, and he never really had the opportunity to. Or maybe never had the avenue in which to do it, the mechanism, didn't know how to explain it to the world. Could have some really profound Gandhi-like, Confucius-like bits of wisdom to share with people. Maybe only shared it with his children and never shared it with anybody else. Well, let's say you want to look back and you want to understand more about Bob Smith. How do you do that? We can't really do it after the fact, so you got to kind of start preparing for it. Okay, so now we have a young Bob Smith. He's in his teens and 20s maybe, and he kind of enrolls in this program where you're not necessarily you're not creating content to be famous now. You're creating content to be remembered in the future. We just passed 8 billion people. By 2050, we should be around 10 billion people. And depending on population rate increases or decreases, that number could continue to increase or potentially plateau at the 12 to 14, 15 billion. That's over the next say 50 years. What about once we start going to space, interplanetary? Musk is going to put us on Mars here soon. What if you have a bunch of people living on Mars and a bunch of people living on the moon in 200-300 years from now? What's to say what if there's 20 billion people across, Earth and Mars and the moons, plus space stations? What if there's at the point where there's 30 billion people? Back at a time when there was only 8 billion people, if you're making content now, if you're making a name, not making a name, you're not trying to be famous, but if you're releasing things, if you're putting stuff out, if you're recording, if you're documenting your life, there's going to be more and more of a demand in the future to look back and understand what we went through. I guess there's some logic here that we should take a big step back and look at things like the Drake equation. Look at how old is the universe? Where's the other aliens? It's such a vast expanse of space out there. Why isn't there any other civilizations? Why haven't we been contacted yet? It's all, bear with me, but maybe the reason we haven't seen any aliens yet, maybe the reason we haven't had any real UFOs, maybe the reason that we can't just look out in the cosmos and see, Dyson spheres and see all these artifacts of other civilizations is because they haven't started yet. The universe as we know it now is 13.8 billion years old. Sounds like a very long time. What if that's not that long of a time? Like it's going to continue to exist for a very, very, very long time. Life has a particular set of requirements that it needs, not too hot, not too cold, a couple different molecules. We're carbon-based, but life might not necessarily need to be carbon-based. It could be silicone-based. But what if in the last 13 billion years, our planet's, almost 4 billion years, right around 4 billion years old? What if we're the first ones? What if we're the first civilization to start? And everything is coming after us. What if we're the very, very beginning and we have no idea what's coming next? That kind of plays in. So look back at our history on Earth. We've had a couple of goosenecks where the population has dipped down into, potentially even a few thousand people or less. You have some of the great pandemics that have happened, some of the great wars that have happened. Look at the effect that Genghis Khan had on the world and how much the population was reduced just due to one conquest. And we look back and we want to understand these events better. If we could look back at the Egyptian pyramids and look at the social media videos that the workers and the artisans were creating while they were vibrating these stones by frequency into place, right? Like, we would understand their technology so much better, and instead of having to relearn everything, instead of burning down the Library of Alexandria and starting over, we could carry on. We'd be all zipping around in starships by now if we didn't lose all of the information from the previous intelligent societies that came before us. If we had that direct evidence, if we had that, like I said, if we had the social media content from the Egyptians, the world would be a much different place. Okay, take that time scale, let's say take the last 10,000 years and apply it forward. So 10,000 years ago, you've got pyramids, you've got Göbekli Tepe, you've got these early signs of intelligent life, starting civilization and surplus of food, getting out of hunter-gatherer. From that point till now, and then from now forward, what happens in 10,000 years from now? That's a really interesting question. And if they're going to want to know in 10,000 years what we did now. If we think that, if we're at the very beginning here, which we could be the first aliens. We could be the ones that start visiting other planets. We could be the ones that learn how to control the laws of physics ourselves and zip through at much faster speeds than we know how to now. And, we won't be propelled by hydrocarbons and methane gas. We can be just zipping on lasers, right? All sorts of cool physics could come out in the next 10,000 years. If we're the first ones, in 10,000 years, we're going to want to look back now at how we got to the next step. What was our thought process? Who were we? What lessons did we learn? You know, if I could look back and just read autobiographies of individuals in the past, I mean, there's so many people who have lived extraordinary lives. The opportunity to be able to look back and just read about their life and understand their experience and relate to the human condition, learn all the things, go through, you know, the lessons learned. How much would we learn from each other if we didn't have to learn things the hard way and we could just listen to those who came before us and pay attention, right? So you have this. How do you start documenting all of these things? I think it's pretty straightforward. I think we just kind of start doing it ourselves. It's a messaging campaign. You explain to everyone, hey, like in 10,000, even in 500 years, there's going to be way more people, and you are going to be really valuable as a memory, but you're going to be even more valuable as a documented person who existed right now. You lived, you experienced, you learned things, you contributed, you participated. You are part of the human species advancing and progressing forward into the cosmos. You are part of this, and your experience in life is going to become a very, very valuable currency. That's the first step, is getting people to understand how vitally important they are by just experiencing life, just by living, and then documenting that living. And would you not want to tell your own story? We're so bad at telling other people's story. We could put our own creative twist on things. We can interpret things, you know, through our own perspectives, and everyone has a different perspective. So if I live my life, even if I were to have a camera crew follow me around and do the reality TV downloads and talk to people and explain everything that I'm thinking, it's still never going to be my perspective. It's still never going to be through my mind's eye on how I'm experiencing the world. There's always going to be some coloration there. Let's say I've got back pain, and I'm just kind of, you know, you're a little grumpy, you're a little stiff, you're a little, you know, I'm going to look through life with a little bit of a different lens than someone who doesn't have that same experience. They may just color things a little bit differently. Not to say it's not right or wrong, it's just not the experience that I was experiencing. Versus, let's say I'm pain-free, for example, and life is really good. I might paint the world in a little bit brighter of a picture than someone who's had a worse deck of cards. Maybe he's a little more depressed, maybe chemically depressed, something's going on. I may now be living a life that's, you know, much more brighter and rose-colored lenses, with rose-colored lenses, than someone looking from the outside who's got some other things going on. They're not seeing the clarity in which, you know, I have when I look out at the world. So you would want to tell your own story. Things just get distorted. If you want to, if you want someone else to tell your story, by all means. But I think everybody's story is so important in their own right, and everyone's creative enough just to explain themselves and explain their life and explain who they've been to the world for the future to look back on, that I think we should all tell our own stories and share ourselves with the future. And that's where I think it's really important. That's a big step to get over, and that's the first big step, is trying to understand that we're the first advanced intelligent civilization, or could be. We have yet to believe that that's not the case. But if that's the case, we could be the first ones. So we say, you know, we stride on the shoulders of giants that came before us. Every life that has came before us, all the way back to the primordial soup and single-cell to multi-cell selection, survival of the fittest. All of those lives that have came before us, the generations that have came before us, if any one little thing took place in a different manner, we wouldn't exist. You know, if the stars exploded in a slightly different manner and the molecules were scattered out into the different gas clouds that ultimately, you know, blended together to create our planet when everything collided together, if that happened any different, we wouldn't be here. You know, one molecule this way, one molecule that way, and New York wouldn't have existed. It's all butterfly effect, right? So if we put ourselves now in that we now become really, really important for the future generations. It's us who are making those decisions. Our existence, could mean the difference between a city or not a city in the future. And it might not be your actions directly. It may be your actions indirectly. Your existence, maybe it's your children. Maybe your children get married and they have a bunch of kids, and their kids just are wildly successful at life and come up with really good ideas. They help a lot of people. They bring a lot of people together, and then their kids do the same thing, really high performing, bring a bunch of people together, send good messages, educate, do good for humanity and progress the species. And then that carries down, and you may not have started it, but you were part of it, and you still had an effect on it. And in fact, you directly did do it, even though it was a very small action that started in the first place. But you had this big effect, and then all of a sudden now this is this new thriving city, and you're taking care of people, and there's no losers, and there's no homeless, and it's been 10, 15 generations, and the world's a much better place. If you wouldn't have done that, if you wouldn't have lived what you think is a simple life, and that never would have resulted from your actions. So all the little things that we're doing now, the current butterfly wings, are making a really big difference for the future. And I think it's really important to look in that through that lens at how big the future could be. Like I said, we're going to come up on 10 billion people by 2050. What happened? 15 billion people. We're at 8 billion people now. I don't think most people really understand how big of a number that is. We're counting people in the billions. We're counting budgets for countries in the trillions. GDPs are in the trillions of dollars. These are really large numbers, and we're accelerating into the future very quickly. So, okay, we're all really important. Life is coming up next. How do we make a name for ourselves? So even just, I'm working through this as I speak this morning, and a good idea for a name would be like the Achilles Project, right? I want my name. I could live a boring, simple life, with all these gifts that have been given to me. I could, live out my old age and enjoy my life, or I could go to war and I could go down in history as the greatest warrior who ever lived, and everyone will remember my name. A little hubris there, but kind of along those lines is we want people to be able to look back at us. And in my perspective, I would love to share what I've done with the world, the little things that I've learned along the way, the things that have been passed down to me from my parents and grandparents and my friends and those people around me, all the information that I've aggregated and then can turn around and share it with the world. Plus all the little things I think are really important too. On your way to work, like this video that I'm recording right now, on your way to work, and you are thinking about things, and you get those brilliant moments where all of a sudden something just comes to you from the ether, and you understand, and you go, that's why that happens. Oh, I understand that now. That's cool. And you understand. You should write that down. You should be able to share that, because someone else could just read that, and you're going to propel it. So instead of, maybe it's something important, right? It recently clicked for me, for an example, electricity. I've always understood electricity. There's different models you can use to kind of understand how the electrons flow through wires, and you use things like water. And I've been able to recite these things for a long time, right? Like I understand electricity and amperage and voltage, and like I get it, but I don't get it. It's a surreal concept that is not part of our typical daily life, beyond things like comparing it to water through a hose, right? You've got pressure, you've got volume, you've got potential. Never really understood it, but then through this last class I've been taking at work, all of a sudden it just clicked. And now it's like, oh, the electrons bump into each other and they're not actually flowing through and then you have, conductivity of different metals, and that's how it flows better through certain things, and it doesn't. And then it finally, after years, into my mid-30s, like, oh, I get electricity now. There's still way more to understand. You've got, how does electricity flow as a wave? How does it flow as a particle? You start getting into light and deeper sciences, multi-phase. Now it's a whole thing that doesn't make any sense to anybody anymore anyways. So But those little things, if you can come up with those, even those, the tiny little morning commute ideas that you come up with, I think they should just be shared with the world, because someone else may be struggling to understand it, or may not even know that they're struggling to understand it in the first place. And if you were to share these little bits, you're going to propel them. So instead of sitting here for 10 years trying to figure something out, they could just read a little blurb and go, hey, electricity flows like water. And it's like this, right? And they go, oh, that's easy. Then they get to move on to the next task and progress. And now they've taken your 10 years of, sorting through this information, and instead of spending their own 10 years sorting through the same amount of information to come to the same conclusions, you just give them the information, and then they have it, and then now they can take that information and use that to try and come up with a solution for another problem. And that, I think that happens for a lot of us. I mean, that's computer iteration, right? If you take a computer and try and iterate just out in general information and say, like how to drive a car down the street safely. Well, the car's got to drive and bump into everything first to know not to bump into that, right? If you're not giving it any if you're not giving it any input, it's going to hit the go button, and then it's going to stop, and then, well, that's not good. Okay, we'll start over. It's going to hit the go button. It's going to iterate slowly because it's just randomly picking options. If you can give it a little human intelligent ingenuity for that first solution, and say, okay, I might not know how to race, but I at least know don't hit these walls, because that's not going to fit within the parameters of this particular exercise. And you kind of give it a little bit of a head start, and then allow the computer to iterate on that process. That's you're now exponentially faster and more efficient at getting to your goal, whatever that goal is, than if you were to just randomly try stuff. Like randomly trying the entire set of possibilities is a really bad way to do anything. But by giving it tiny little bits, and like I said, you may not think that they're vitally important little bits to you, but it could be really important to someone else. And even on a simple scale, maybe it's things like just simple understanding of language, simple understanding of experience. There's a lot of people in this world that speak a lot of different languages. Maybe you could just explain things in a way in your language to someone that maybe doesn't understand it as well in your language, and then you just say, well, this is why I deserted my dessert in the desert is a very confusing phrase, because in the English language these three words are very similar in appearance but are very different words. So if you could just explain this to someone, and then they would understand it, and it's a tiny little bit of information, but then all of a sudden they would just understand this in a much better way. You may not think that's important, but to somebody else that might be very, very much important. And now they've progressed much, much further than having to try and figure out why that made sense in the first place. So going through a lot of examples, but just trying to illustrate this point. So I think it's really important to document our lives. I think it's really important to document who we are for the future, not knowing we're looking out into the void and the future is very bright. I think there's a lot of things that could take place in the future that maybe limit the progress forward of the human species. But ultimately, I think we're looking at a massive society in front of us. 20 billion people spread across the planets, and then if you go even further, we could just be a spacefaring civilization that's interstellar, intergalactic, and flying around. If we are the shoulders in which that civilization stands on, we should probably start acting like it. And I think this would be a really good plan to get everybody headed that direction. Is first we got to convince people that there's a bunch of stuff coming after our lives, and it's here. It's not heaven. It's not whatever else you believe in could happen, may still happen, but right here, right now, after we're gone, a bunch more stuff is going to happen. And there's a lot of things that we can contribute to in our life now that we'll never see. And those who came before us had that thought. They built things, they participated in things that were greater than themselves, and that would take longer than their own lives lasted, and they knew that they would never see it completed. They knew it would never even, the project may not even begin in their lifetime, but they contributed and they participated in something that was bigger than them, that would last longer than them, and that's exactly what happened. And you had a lot of people that tried to do things so that the future would look back and go, well, you know, all of these people throughout this whole process participated in this, and that's what made this great, is because it was greater than any one person, and it was greater than even their own lifetime, and they contributed into the future without even knowing what we'll never know what that future looks like, because we can't experience it. We'll be gone. But we can do things now that will make that future a better place for everybody that gets to experience it. I think we document our lives. I don't know how that looks, but I think we just have to document our lives and share it without ego, and have ego, but just share ourselves with the future. Call it the Achilles Project. I'm sure there's a better name for it, but that's kind of the inspiration for, you know, remembering our names, remembering the future. Let me know if it's a good or bad idea.